Very
Okay.
good. Yep, gotcha.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending. I'm really happy to share some work that I've been doing at the Rubenstein Lab at UVM. That's led to some exciting new ventures that I'll talk about briefly. And yeah, we'll get started here. And we'll get started here like that. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about myself. Not that that wasn't a great introduction, but like Chris said, I consider myself a food web ecologist. And so that means I study energy flow through an ecosystem. And my current work is, of course, in Lake Champlain. I've been here for a few years, but I came here from marine ecosystems, and that's going to inform a lot of the work that I talk about today. So I've worked in salt marshes, mangroves, reefs, seagrasses, lots of other kinds of ecosystems, and that kind of gives me a unique perspective on food webs that I hope to kind of share with all of you. My current work has involved, again, like I said, understanding the impacts of invasive species that have come into the lake or will come into the lake on the food web of the lake. So we published a paper on a food web model of alewife, which has some interesting results, especially compared to the Great Lakes. And then I will be starting a new kind of expansion of that model in anticipation of round goby invasion, which are not in the lake yet, but may show up sometime potentially soon, as well as kind of a space for time look at alewife impacts across multiple lakes, not just Lake Champlain, but George and Lake Memphremagog, which I will touch on briefly. And I've also been involved with some diet analyses of nearshore communities, wetlands, which I'll talk about, as well as understudied deep lake species, such as this fish trout perch, which I will also talk about today. So I've said the word food webs quite a bit, and I wanted to start off by talking about what is a food web and why it's important and why it's important to understand it for an ecosystem. And so food webs kind of get to this fundamental question in ecology and understanding the environment, which is how do we organize the world, right? How do we organize everything we see in the environment in an ecosystem? And this is kind of like Darwin approached this question in a very different way. He came up with rules about, like evolution and things like that, where he organized the world by traits, by relatedness. He said things are related to each other, they originated from each other, and that's how he's, kind of formulated an idea of how to organize the world. But studying things in terms of food webs also answer the same question, but instead of organizing things by relatedness, we organize things by how energy flows. So, how energy or nutrients enter an ecosystem and how they flow up through all those animals that we see, and yeah, through trophic relationships. So, how does energy get from plants to things to food to things that those fish that you might like to catch eat? And so it's kind of answering the same fundamental question in ecology, just organizing things in a little bit different of a way. And you can see, so building these food webs to understand our ecosystems, you can see from this figure how that could really get complicated very quickly with all of these dots representing an individual, a group of animals, a group of plants or stuff, and then all these gray lines kind of indicating all of those trophic relationships. Um, and so that can get very complicated very quickly, but I kind of want to touch on two aspects that I find interesting about food webs that further complicate things beyond just kind of like the scale of those interactions. So the first thing is that sometimes animals move around, right? They don't stay in one place all the time, at least not all of them. And by being in one spot, moving and eating something, and then moving and eating something somewhere else or getting eaten somewhere else, right? Those food webs don't just relate to one spot, they're incorporated over space. I think I mentioned in the abstract, if you read it, that you catch a fish in your favorite fishing spot, you throw it back, it doesn't just stick around there, it goes to someone else's favorite fishing spot and gets caught there, right? And so the food web is inherently inseparable from a spatial aspect. And then the other thing is that when things move around, they move around across a landscape that has a lot of different kinds of landscapes in a mosaic, right? And so we can think about our lake, like up top there, that's Missisquoi Bay. We can think about Missisquoi Bay being embedded in a landscape mosaic of all these different habitat types. You see different plots of land. There's a marsh there where the Missisquoi River comes in. These habitats that we define are not kind of these closed systems. They all kind of flow into each other and things move across those boundaries. Both easy to see, like both on top of the lake, like you can see at the top, and then even at depth, there are lots of these different types of habitats that kind of make up all these different areas that things move around between. And so if we take it to like an ecosystem that we might all know, such as like Shelburne Pond right down the road, and we want to understand the food web of this area, it kind of gets complicated when you have to take into account that maybe these smaller fish that exist in these different parts of the lake, they're responding, their populations, what they do, where they eat, is responding to the resources that are present across that space. So up at the top, there might be, more input um, from prey falling in from the forest versus like wetland animals and things like that for that fish to eat. That might be very different from the other side of the lake or the pond where there are more of those wetland-based prey. And then when we want to understand kind of how that leads up to a fish we might want to catch, right, we have to incorporate that spatial variability, that landscape aspect. And so understanding food webs as coupled in space across these habitats are really powerful because they can incorporate heterogeneity, so they can incorporate those differences in resource availability across a landscape. They can account for, like I said, the way that different consumers move. The different sized fish have different capacity to kind of incorporate more of that landscape. They can move further and so understanding food webs as having a spatial aspect really enhances our ability to incorporate that part of things. It really changes the way we understand maybe some common ecological observations or paradigms when we think about things being connected beyond kind of what is local to what we're seeing. Also, food webs tend to be a little more stable than they're predicted, and that is because things can move around and kind of incorporate things um, uh, outside of kind of boundaries that we put around them. So it kind of helps explain some real world food web stability. And it also sets a framework for how we can understand how management actions might influence ecosystems beyond what they are what's locally being managed. So by, let's say we restore something, we add habitat somewhere here, and then fish that swim from all over come and use that habitat, and then they swim back, right? So that management action had an influence on the ecosystem what it beyond just that local aspect. It has these actions that can influence ecosystems over distances. And the last thing that these frameworks can do is they actually incorporate angler knowledge in this way. A great example is how you can go to the store and you can buy all these baits that are mimicking animals that don't live with fish, right? You can see that bass really loved that parakeet lure, right? And so this is something that like anglers really already know is that fish eat things that don't live with them. And so understanding kind of the ecosystem in this way incorporates that knowledge. And so, like I said, I came from more marine ecosystems a few years ago when I came here. And these concepts of spatially coupled food webs are easily kind of incorporated into the way we view those systems. And a lot of times it's because those connections between those different subhabitats occur kind of over a day. So we can see them, right? In salt marshes, they're very tidally driven. You can see that connectivity change, and you can understand that things swim across when they're able to, when the tide's high enough, they can connect kind of flooded habitats. Same thing in mangroves that I've worked in. But these things are also important for freshwater habitats. So we can think about a stream, like a stream in a forest. Think about that we can bound, that we have the stream habitat over here, and we have the forest surrounding it. But think about all the things that transverse this habitat boundary, whether it's um, invertebrates emerging from those streams, things, leaves, things falling into the stream, right? These are really important. These cross habitat connections are really important for the food webs of both of these ecosystems. And so, yeah, so they're important in freshwaters too, not just marine ecosystems. And so what I've been trying to do is show that we also have a similar um, setup here in large, deep lakes. And so one aspect, um, one kind of habitat division occurs during the summer months when we see a thermocline set up in the deeper portions of the lake. So just as a little background of that, in the summer, the sun comes down, it warms the top layer of the lake. Warmer water has a different density than colder water, and so what you get is you get a layer of warm water sitting on top of a layer of cold water, and then you get a segregation for fish or whatever animals that prefer warm water versus cold water. And so you get these distinct habitats within a few hundred meters of each other in the lake. And so you have, yeah, you have a warm water habitat and a cold water habitat, and that sets up kind of this habitat divide. Um, and so things that can move across those boundaries become really important for understanding the food web of the lake. Because if, like I mentioned before, if you can live at depth in these cold areas here, and you can swim up and get eaten by something in the warm area, you have, in doing that, have moved uh, energy and linked these two food webs that are otherwise separated by this habitat boundary, right? So understanding this link is really important to understanding um, food web and fisheries production in lake, especially our lake, Lake Champlain. And so what I want to do now is kind of talk about a couple case studies. One's a little bit more put together than the other. One's like a submitted paper, the other one's more preliminary, um, where we've kind of incorporated this cross habitat framework to expand what we know about Lake Champlain. And so to start, I want to start with these little guys that you see in front of you, a fish called trout perch. So trout perch are really interesting fish. They are not something that you might catch. They're more of like a prey species. They're smaller. And they are invertebrous, so they eat lots of these little chironomids and other kind of insect larvae and things like that found at the bottom of the lake. And we catch them in really, really high densities in those deep cold water regions. And so here at the bottom, you see we have, this is from some trawling data from the lab, and we have these different densities of all these different fish that we caught in our trawls. And all these red dots are trout perch. And if you compare them to stuff like these blue dots and these green dots, like over here, we catch trout perch in really high densities, almost as high as we would catch things like this is rainbow smelt and alewife. These are things that we know lots of fish like to eat. So we catch them. There's plenty of them down there. There's tons of them, almost as many as a lot of the other food items that are down in the deeper portions of the lake. And when we assess them just based on their energetic content, right? So how much energy would they provide a predator that would eat them? They're pretty much the same again as those alewife and smelt. Maybe a little bit less energy dense, so maybe not as many calories, but pretty close to being similar to all these other fish that we know are really good food for deep water, cold water predators. But despite all that, despite them being a lot of them and them being good to eat, we actually don't really see them in any of our diet analyses of deep water fish. So, like lake trout, things like burbot, they don't really eat them as much as you'd think they would based on how many there are and how good they are to eat. And so that's kind of a paradox in lake ecosystems where they're kind of thought of as this afterthought. They've been talked about as what's called a trophic bottleneck, meaning that energy kind of goes instead of going from those benthic inverts up the food chain to those fish that we might want to catch. They just kind of get moved off. They don't continue up. They don't get eaten. It doesn't get incorporated. And that's not really how we think of how food webs form. They typically would, the idea is that food webs typically form to most efficiently move that energy up the food chain. So the idea is that like for a native species like trout perch, which doesn't really, um, which is which yeah, which represents kind of this large bit of this large pool of energy, you wouldn't expect it to just kind of be not incorporated into the food web. It likely gets incorporated somewhere. And what's also interesting is that if you go back to kind of older fish texts, you see that they're talked about, trout perch are, as a most important forage fish for fish like walleye, brook trout, yellow perch, even freshwater drum, and northern pike. So all of these fish that are thought of as a warm water fish, this fish that we catch in the very deepest parts of the lake was at one point at least considered a really important prey item for. And they also note that they make these cross-habitat movements into shallow water to feed and then back again. And the so with all that in mind, I kind of wanted to ask the question, could these trout perch couple those warm water and cold water habitats, right? Could they actually serve a really important role? They're not this trophic bottleneck. The reason that we don't catch them is maybe because we're not looking in the right place because they're actually important in a completely different part of the ecosystem. And so how did I do that? Well, I actually took what I knew of salt marshes, right? So that's what you see here. This is a salt marsh. I took that kind of trophic relay paradigm, and I know that in salt marshes, or I've been a part of work in salt marshes that shows that small fishes, such as these guys are called mummy chug. They're little small prey fishes. They are really important in connecting the aquatic habitat to the marsh platform that's sometimes dry, sometimes wet. So when they can get up there, they get up onto the marsh platform, they eat tons of little bugs, they come back down, they get eaten by bigger predators, and in doing so, they're really important in connecting these disparate habitats. And so to show that work that I was involved with, what we did was we knew how many fish were in the creek. We knew how much prey were in these different habitat zones, the marsh creeks versus the marsh platform. And we converted all that information into a common denominator, which is energy or carbon, right? And so when we do that, we can compare how much energy there is in creek prey, marsh prey, and compare that to mummy trout fish prey, and actually see do they need to get up onto this marsh platform to support those populations? And so when we do that, and I wouldn't worry specifically about the numbers on this, but like when we do that and you just account for creek prey, what you find is that there is not enough prey in these creeks to support the fish populations that we see. It's only by adding in these marsh platform this marsh platform prey, can you explain how many fish are in those creeks? And so with that in mind, I applied that principle to our ecosystem. And so we went out, we caught a bunch of trout perch on these trawls back in 2021, caught them at depth. We were able to quantify how many trout perch we saw, and we compared that to the invertebrate communities at deep and shallow depths. So we dropped these ponars, which are they're like a big scoop, and you drop it down, it scoops an area of sediment that hopefully has lots of invertebrates, bugs, prey in it, and then we can quantify invertebrate prey biomass that way. And so we did those above and below the thermocline. And so, like I said, I took that exact paradigm and I applied it to our system. So we quantified shallow, deep prey, and we compared that to trout perch densities to see could trout perch serve um, as a connector of these two habitats. And so when we do that, may not be surprising based on the last one, is that yeah, there is not enough prey at these deep sites to support trout perch in the densities that we see. There just isn't enough stuff down there for them to eat. And it's only by accounting for these shallow water prey items can we explain how many trout perch are actually down there. And so what this shows is that these trout perch do have the capacity to serve as connectors of lake habitats, of these deep and shallow habitats, and may be really important in moving benthic energy from the deep water to up to those shallow water habitats, just like the mummy chugs that I was associated with in salt marshes, a very different kind of habitat, but maybe functioning in the same way, um, kind of moving energy across that boundary. This is also important because trout perch are one of many fish that do this, right? There are lots of other benthic associated fish in the lake that are known to be found across these habitat depths. So things like darters and sculpins are known to come shallow and known to be deep. We catch them in both habitats. And so this may highlight a whole role for all of these benthic fish in moving energy across that habitat boundary. And this is also important because, as I mentioned, Lake Champlain is facing an invasion, a potential future invasion by two species that are going to really change that benthic landscape. So round goby I mentioned and quagga mussels are really going to alter kind of the landscape of where productivity is in that benthic habitat. And this kind of it leads to some future work that we're doing. We're starting this new project where I've expanded my food web model to incorporate what might happen to the food webs across the lake as round goby invade. And this is something that we're currently working to understand. We're starting a new project in conjunction with the Lake Champlain Basin program to kind of build the model and understand how that might work. So just kind of preempting a question here, we still don't really see trout perch eaten. I showed before we don't see them eaten in lake trout. We don't really see them in really any predators in the lake. And why might that be? And I don't really have a good answer for that. It could be that we just don't see, haven't looked at the benthic habitat or the nearshore habitat enough. We haven't seen what a lot of those predators are eating. That's possible. But I do have a theory, and this kind of relates to some work that we've done previously. Um, so this is kind of the paper where I modeled alewife invasion, and one of the findings, one of my favorite findings from that paper, is that it seems that alewife sort of simplified the water column portion of that food web, where now by eating an alewife, you are closer. There are fewer steps between an alewife and the actual sources that they consume as maybe a benthic prey item or other native pelagic predators. And so, could it be possible that recent species invasions changed the need for consumers to actually rely on that benthic channel, right? Did they kind of alter the degree to which habitats need to be coupled in Lake Champlain by coming in and being this more energetic prey? And part of that, we're part of as part of that, we're starting a new kind of venture with funded by Sea Grant to kind of understand how the alewife invasion affected this potential functioning using a space for time approach, where we can't really take alewife out of this lake, but we can compare it to lakes nearby that don't have alewife, and we can understand kind of the impact that alewife had on the system through that comparison. So kind of using lakes without alewife to go back in time to see how might the lake have looked like before alewife came in. Do we see more benthic or cross habitat coupling in the food web there? Okay, so that's the first kind of case study. Really quick, I want to use the rest of my time to talk about a completely different case study that I've also been working on, moving further inshore, not just deep and shallow food webs, but now shallow and wetlands. And so I've spent a lot of time talking about the habitat divide between deeper portions and warmer, shallower portions of the lake and how important energy moving across that habitat divide could be. But there's another aspect, which is the fringing wetlands of the lake. So areas that might be grass, you might see them flooded. They have creeks running through them, right? These areas are also connected intermittently to the lake by water levels. And so wetlands can be really important. They can be some of the most productive habitats in the lake. And they exist at the margins between the water and the land, and they've actually become adapted to that intermittent connectivity, the intermittent like water that's associated with with flooding and things like that. And so we're going to move over to this, we're going to leave those deep habitats behind and kind of move over to those wetlands connections. And so And so there are lots of wetlands within the Lake Champlain Basin. Only a few of them are actually directly connected to the lake. The ones that are really seem to respond to consistent springtime flooding. So half of all the stream flow typically comes in the spring in Lake Champlain, and this is water level. This figure that you see here is water level over the last 10 years, and this line represents the level at which wetlands get flooded. And you can see that pretty much every year we see a flooding event in these a springtime flood of these wetlands. And this is not like, the destructive flooding that we saw, necessarily the destructive flooding that we saw this past summer. This is a natural process that occurs as these lake levels rise in the spring. And these wetlands are adapted to respond to that. And you can imagine that with water comes an ability to access different areas for fish, right? They need water to swim around. And so, how could we understand how that flooding, how that connectivity um, might impact food webs? Well, let's go really far away. We'll go to the Shark River in the Everglades in Florida, right? We'll draw from some mangrove work, and so that's what you see in front of you here. You see this is the Shark River coming up through the Everglades. The ocean is kind of over here in the top left, and this river kind of comes up here. And so what occurs is these systems have a wet and dry season where they're flooded during this period. This line is where uh, these freshwater marshes flood, and then they dry, and then they flood again, and they dry. And so during those flooded seasons, um, lots of prey fishes, mostly sunfishes, disperse into kind of the areas of the marsh. And then as those systems dry, as that water level drops, they get concentrated down into small creeks and rivulets and things. And so they go from having this whole big floodplain to this small area. And what you get is that these predators, all the way from the coast, these are snook, these are estuarine predators, they come all the way up the river, timed to when they expect this to occur. And so they come all the way up the river, they migrate all the way up, they eat a ton of these sunfish, and then they go back. And so that flooding controls this massive subsidy of kind of fresh marsh production of energy that supports these ecosystems very far away. And so what I was interested in is, do our marshes in Lake Champlain function similarly? We see that every spring they flood in a very similar way. They flood and then they dry. And so do they function in that similar way where, and we focused for this preliminary work, we focused just on this one marsh complex near Mallett's Bay, Mallett's Creek. And you can see here, this is just a Google shot up top in April and early June to early June. These marshes kind of look like this, where you can see this whole creek is flooded. And it's a little bit tough to see, but this is all flooded all the way back kind of to the highway, right? All this habitat is open. So do these little fish, they go and they expand their range. They're all in this marsh as it's flooded. And then as those marshes dry, they would have to be concentrated off that marsh platform into the deeper creek and be concentrated and available for nearshore predators to come in and focus on them as those marshes dry in the summer. And so this is like a preliminary thing that we have just started, just kind of played around with this past summer. And so I have two kind of sets of data that we were looking at to kind of address this question. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife does this lamprey trapping, which is for the purpose of lamprey removal. They install these lamprey traps, like they're this kind of metal box that you see here along in the upper reaches of the creek, and they catch lots of different things. The idea is that they catch a lot of lamprey, but they also catch a lot of small fish, which they record. And so we use this, 10-year data set that they have of all their bycatch in these traps that they install. And so when we look at it all together, and so this is the spring, this is the trap starting in April through July of this past 10 years. And we have all this abundance data for all these different species that they catch. And so here we see at the top, we see all these minnows, shiners, different prey, like little prey fish that fish would eat. And we see that, yeah, right when those marshes flood, so they're flooding through April, May into June, we get a spike in the abundance of prey fish that are caught in these traps that kind of goes down as those marshes dry and that water recedes. So that's a good indicator that there is something going on with this pulse of prey. And then if we look here at the bottom, what I've done here is I've taken the number of days where we see the number of days in a given year where those marshes flood. So that's where the lake level is above that 97-foot level where the marshes flood. And when we do that, we see that in when you have more flood days, when you have more days of marsh flooding, you tend to catch more prey fish. So more small yellow perch, those shiners and minnows and sunfish. We tend to catch more of these prey items in those traps when there's more days of flooding in a given year. Um, and then, so then this summer, we also went out to say, okay, we see these flood pulse related increases in prey abundance. So do we actually see that translate to predators that we catch in those creeks, um, relying on those prey species more? And so this was done with a lot of gill netting in Mallett's Creek this past summer. And what we see from all these large predators that we caught in these fish or in these gill nets is that as those marshes are flooding, predators that we catch in the marsh versus predators that we catch kind of offshore in the deeper parts of Mallett's Bay are using a lot more, or they're relying a lot more on fish, like the ones that we saw spike when those floods are occurring uh, in Malice Creek. And then as those marshes begin to dry, we still see them relying a lot more on those fish. So as those fish get concentrated down into the channels, predators in those channels are relying a lot more on that subsidy, on that resource subsidy from the marsh there. So that's just some like preliminary evidence. This is kind of like an ongoing thing that we're still working to understand, but just some evidence showing that um, those wetlands may actually contribute to nearshore predators in the lake. And so why is this important? Well, like I said before, we all saw this past summer um, the extreme flooding events that can occur, right? And, uh, unfortunately, with expected climate change, we expect more extreme flooding events. And so that is a greater potential for this off-season kind of connectivity outside of that normal spring flood. We might get an extra period of connectivity that could be really important for um, those warm water communities that rely on that wetland pulse. So at the top here, we have that water level graph where all the years are kind of on top of each other. This orange one is this past year, and we can see in August the lake was higher than it really had ever been in the past 10 years. And that means that fish had much more access this past year to those wetlands. How will those impact the How will that impact the food webs of the lake? We really need to understand the connectivity between wetland and nearshore food webs to understand how that might change things. And then even beyond just like extreme events, right, we would expect changes to the duration and magnitude of that normal spring flooding. So warmer temperatures, they might lead to less snow, which might lead to less stream flow and a faster dry down period. So the marshes might flood and then that floodwater might recede a lot faster in warmer temperatures. Precipitation patterns, so more rain versus snow coming, so that changes the ratio of water that's held and released in the spring versus water that just kind of flows right out. Um, and then we would also expect kind of a change in like the dynamics of the system. So growing seasons, marsh impacts, right? How will all these affect the food webs of the lake? We really need to understand how those systems are connected in order to understand what uh, how these changes might be incorporated into the ecosystem. And so with that, I mean, hopefully this just gives you a little taste of how we can incorporate these cross-habitat frameworks and learn a lot about the lake in ways that we might not have before. How these can really like expand kind of how we think of how the lake functions and really use it to address problems and unknowns about kind of how our ecosystem functions by kind of expanding to understand food webs as these linked systems across these landscapes. Um, yeah, and with that, these slides never really incorporate all the people that go into work Obviously, we got data from a lot of different sources. Lots of people helped throughout, my lab and all for all these studies. I really want to highlight some of the undergrads that we took out with us to help us catch some of these fish, some of which you see here. And yeah, thanks to everyone who helped with all this work over the years. And yeah, and with that, I will take questions.